Welcome to Florida's Cannabis News Podcast, a weekly podcast exploring the legal, political, and economic changes to Florida's cannabis industry, covering important news and events for Florida cannabis businesses and professionals. Sit back and relax. Florida's Cannabis News Podcast begins now.
Hey everybody, today is November 11th, 2020, and this is David, your host at Florida's Cannabis News Podcast. Happy Veterans Day to all service members out there. Thank you so much for your service. You guys make the ultimate sacrifice, and we here at the podcast greatly appreciate it. November 11th is also my dad's birthday. Today he turns 80 trips around the sun. That's pretty cool. So today we are continuing with our 5-part series on cannabis taxation. Specifically, we're talking everything 280E and its impact on the United States cannabis industry. In part 1 of the series, we kind of set the table, if you will. We set the foundation. We walked through the evolution of the United States' approach to a pro-taxpayer tax code. We talked about how Congress raised revenue under the 1916 code. We also spoke about how the Supreme Court changed their interpretation of the code throughout the 50s and 60s. This was due to public uneasiness in the rise of heroin and opium addiction and letting illegal businesses deduct business expenses. Pretty interesting history, how the tax code has come to be and its interaction with public society at large. We talked about Senate debates, we reviewed congressional hearings, and learned why the code is set up the way it is. So if that interests you, if you want to nerd out with some tax law, some tax history, definitely check out part 1 of the show. Definitely check out part 1, which was yesterday's episode. Today, we are continuing the story of 280E into the 1970s and 1980s. We're talking war on drugs, President Richard Nixon, the Controlled Substances Act. We're also going to talk about President Reagan's attempt to regulate drug use through the tax code itself, which is pretty interesting. You would think you'd regulate drug use through criminal law, which they did through the CSA, but another approach President Reagan took was to reduce drug use through taxes, which is the whole point of 280E. And finally, we're going to break down the text of 280E itself. Part 2 is super important to understanding how 280E came to be today. I'm looking forward to unpacking everything, and with that said, let's dive right into it. America and cannabis have a well-documented industrial and medicinal relationship. Around 1611, colonist farmers cultivated America's first cannabis crop and used the plant as fiber for rope and clothing. By the 1850s, cannabis was a patent medicine available in United States pharmacies, where it remained a staple for over 60 years. In 1906, Congress passed the Federal Food and Drug Act, which is one of the nation's first efforts to regulate commercial drugs, food, and dietary supplements. Now, this act allowed the U.S. Department of Agriculture to ensure the safe use of cannabis through its Bureau of Chemistry. However, by the early 1920s, cities and states in the South began prohibiting the use of cannabis. Now, in many of these states, the rationale was racially motivated. This is well documented in many books I've read and many legal scholars have cited. Lurid newspaper headlines promoted the alleged dangers of cannabis, swept the nation, and led to the establishment of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which was an agency used to warn Americans about the alleged perils of pot. Public concern about illegal drug use rose in the 30s due to the Federal Bureau of Narcotics media campaign that warned Americans of the alleged perils of cannabis. In 1930, Congress renamed the Federal Bureau of Narcotics into the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, which is an agency we all know and love in the industry and became the new regulatory body for drugs in the United States. Now, in 1937, Representative Robert Doughton of North Carolina responded to the public's concern when he introduced House Bill 6385. House Bill 6385 sought to stamp out the adult use of cannabis by imposing a prohibitive tax on the plant. House Bill 6385 was challenged. First, Fiorello LaGuardia, then mayor of New York City, formed a committee to study the effects of cannabis. The committee published the LaGuardia report, which concluded that cannabis was not addictive and was not motivating into major crimes and was not common among children. Second, in a legislative hearing, the American Medical Association opposed the bill when it argued that the proposed bill would severely hamper physicians' ability to utilize cannabis's therapeutic potential. Now, despite the LaGuardia report and the American Medical Association's protest, Franklin Roosevelt signed the Marijuana Tax Act into law, which ushered in the federal government's venture into the criminal enforcement of cannabis laws. The 1960s, almost 30 years after the passage of the federal cannabis prohibition, brought dramatic social change to the United States, and in many ways, cannabis was at the center of it. This counterculture movement centered on freedom, civil rights, and peace. Drugs specifically, crystallized all the negatives of the counterculture due to its presence in music and widespread use among young adults. Cannabis struck uneasiness in parents, local law enforcement, and likely triggered President Nixon's focus on substance abuse during his presidency. In 1971, with the goal to stop drug use in the United States, President Nixon declared a war on drugs. As part of his war on drugs, President Nixon enacted the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act of 1970, which has lasting effects on today's United States cannabis market. Title II of this act, also known as the Controlled Substances Act, the CSA, serves as the legal foundation for the government's war on drugs. The act created the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, to enforce the CEA and determine how certain drugs and substances will be regulated. The Controlled Substances Act also categorized drugs into and substances into classifications. But rather than leaving the classifications of drugs to the FDA or scientific community, Congress categorized the substances into 5 schedules based on the drugs or substances' medicinal value and potential for abuse. Schedule 1 drugs are considered to be the most dangerous because they have a high potential for abuse and have no currently accepted medical use in the United States. Congress classified cannabis, LSD, and heroin as Schedule 1 drugs. Schedule 2 drugs also have a high potential for abuse, but have an accepted medical use in the United States. Now, of course, we've seen the medical application of cannabis across time, but I'm just going through the classifications as the federal government sees it. So, as I mentioned, Schedule 2 drugs also have a high potential for abuse, but according to the government, they have an accepted medical use. Cocaine is a Schedule 2 drug. Schedule 3 drugs have a lower potential for abuse and have a currently accepted medical use. Schedule 4 drugs have an even lower potential for abuse and a currently accepted medical use. Schedule 5 drugs are considered to be the least dangerous because they have the lowest potential for abuse and also have a currently accepted medical use. Schedule 5 drug substances are typically over-the-counter medicines, for example, cough medicines, or with small amounts of codeine. Now, the classification of cannabis as a Schedule 1 drug was intended to be temporary, actually, because the Controlled Substances Act also called for the creation of a federal commission to study cannabis. After 2 years of research, Congress's Cannabis Commission, the National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse, rebutted negative claims about cannabis. Now, speaking before Congress, the commission's chairperson at the time, Republican Governor Raymond Schaefer of Pennsylvania, actually recommended that Congress decriminalize cannabis, quote, because of the little proven danger of physical or psychological harm, and that cannabis should no longer be classified as a Schedule 1 drug. So the CSA said, hey, listen, these are our classifications. We're going to have it temporary, and let's reconvene and see what our research shows. So Mr. Schaefer came back and said, hey, listen, there's no proven danger of physical or psychological harm, and cannabis doesn't need to be scheduled this tightly. Of course, President Nixon did not adopt the commission's recommendation, thus keeping cannabis under the lovely Schedule 1 controlled substance classification we have today. Now, the Controlled Substances Act expanded government power over the regulation of drugs on all levels. State legislators expanded on the federal initiative and utilized the CSA scheduling system to update their criminal statutes in accordance with the CSA. With the DEA empowered and the most comprehensive prohibition of substances in American history enacted into law, future presidents would rely heavily on the DEA and the CSA to boost their tough on crime, tough on drug initiatives. In August of 1974, President Nixon resigned, but the war on drugs raged on. Throughout the 1980s, public concern about drug use built, largely due to media portrayals of people addicted to smokable forms of cocaine, which they dubbed crack. This concern set up President Ronald Reagan's expansion of Nixon's war on drug policy soon after President Reagan took office in 1981. President Reagan took numerous approaches to deter drug use, mostly through no-tolerance criminal statutes like mandatory prison sentencing for simple possession. But President Reagan also combated drug trafficking through federal taxation, which is the whole point of this podcast. As previously discussed, up till 1982, the Internal Revenue Code and U.S. courts used the legality of the business expense, not the legality of the business itself, as the touchstone to determine tax deductibility. Remember, the United States Tax Court permitted individuals engaged in illegal drug trafficking to deduct ordinary and necessary business expenses as long as the expenses satisfied the interpretation of ordinary and necessary under Section 162, as the Supreme Court set out in 1966 in a huge case in the cannabis industry called Edmondson v. Commissioner. Now, in this case, the court allowed a drug dealer to deduct his business expense in relation to his drug trafficking business and construing the term necessary as imposing only the minimal requirement that the expense be appropriate and helpful for the taxpayer's business. Now, also, the court has a great quote in Commissioner v. Tellier, also in 1966, construing the term necessary as imposing only the minimal requirement that the expense be appropriate and helpful to develop the taxpayer's business. Now, in direct response to Edmondson v. Commissioner, which was a case before the United States Tax Court in 1981, the drafters of the 1982 tax code parted ways with the 1969 code and turned the focus of deductibility to the legality of the business itself, not the source of the income. Now, breaking down the Edmondson v. Commissioner case, here the petitioner was a self-employed drug dealer. He sold cannabis, cocaine, and amphetamines out of his apartment. The petitioner asserted his right under Section 162 to deduct business expenses, even though his enterprise was obviously illegal. Now, in the taxable year in question, the petitioner's business expenses included over $100,000 in cost of goods sold, around $800 in rent, roughly $200 in telephone calls, and $50 for a small scale. In this case, the tax court held that the petitioner was allowed to deduct those expenses because those are ordinary and necessary expenses for a business. Thus, the tax court continued the regular application of ordinary and necessary under 162, again, to only mean that was the business expense appropriate and helpful in developing his business? Now, after this opinion was published, Congress kind of freaked out. They wanted to prevent other drug traffickers from following suit. So Congress's Senate Finance Committee thought allowing drug dealers to benefit from business expense deductions while stealing billions of dollars per year from U.S. citizens was against the public's best interest. The committee urged that such deductions must be disallowed on public policy grounds. So as a result, Congress used, conveniently, the CSA's categorization system and enacted Section 280E as part of the Tax Equity and Fiscal Responsibility Tax Act of 1982. Section 280E is a tax law that denies the deduction of virtually every single business expense to businesses selling Schedule I or Schedule II controlled substances. Now here I'm going to read you verbatim Section 280E. Here we go. Quote, No deduction or credit shall be allowed for any amount paid or incurred during the taxable year in carrying on any trade or business if such trade or business consists of trafficking in controlled substances, which is prohibited by federal law or the law of any state in which such trade or business is conducted. Now, with the enactment of Section 280E, if a taxpayer trafficked a Schedule 1 or Schedule 2 controlled substance, they lost virtually every ability to deduct any business expense under Section 182, except for costs of goods sold. On its face, Section 280E contradicts the original stated purpose of the code, which is to tax all income regardless of the legality of the business itself. Section 280E also stands in direct conflict with the drafter's intent to derive tax revenue from any source whatever. The Supreme Court and U.S. Tax Court used the drafter's intent as a foundation for determining deductibility from 1916 all the way up until 1982. Now, the decision to enact 280E hinged on Congress's primary goal to deter drug use, which contradicts, again, the drafter's intent not to change a man's moral character, which we discussed earlier in this podcast. Now, we have to think of the 80s and just what happened with Nixon and the war on drugs and Reagan's no-tolerance drug policies. Picture how crazy the United States was at this time. Now, the desired result of Section 280E was to burden drug traffickers when they filed federal income tax for their businesses by disallowing all business expense deductions of their illegal business. Now, in theory, this is what Congress thought. Theoretically, the drug trafficker would be overburdened by the lack of available deductions under 162 and eventually dissolve their illegal drug trafficking business. Congress actually didn't change Section 162 in any way. They just merely took the ability to deduct business expenses under 162 from drug dealers, except for cost of goods sold, which I will discuss later in this podcast. Now let's dive into the intent of Section 280E. The 1982 House report doesn't shed light on Congress's intent behind Section 280E, but the 1982 Senate report shows that Congress relied on public policy as the primary reason to add Section 280E into the tax code. The report noted Congress's dislike for drug dealing when it stated that drug dealers, quote, should not be afforded the benefit of business expense deductions. Congress believed there is sharply defined public policy against drug dealing. The Senate report also shows no indication that Congress tried to satisfy the public policy doctrine test set out by the Supreme Court, but the codification did align with the public policy doctrine. Now, reading the legislative history, I think it's reasonable to infer that Congress thought an exceptional circumstance existed, as the court defined in 1966. That is, by allowing drug dealers to deduct business expenses, frustrated sharply defined national policy, the Controlled Substances Act, and allowing these deductions were severe and immediate because the United States was fighting at this time a, quote, war on drugs, which, if you've read a few books or you've read a few articles online, we know the war on drugs, a lot of it was racially motivated. Now, Section 280E actually reaches further than Section 162 because 280E even disallows deductions for expenses that are not illegal per se. For example, salaries, rent, and telephone. Now, Section 280E disallows deductions to businesses who traffic Schedule 1 or 2 substances, regardless if the expense is illegal or not. In comparison, Section 162 only disallows deductions for illegal expenses. Section 280E reintroduced the inconsistency the 1969 Congress eliminated when they codified the public policy doctrine into Section 162. Remember, under the 1969 tax code, state legal cannabis business owners would be able to deduct all business expenses afforded to mainstream industries because business expenses in today's legal cannabis industry they do meet ordinary and necessary under the Supreme Court's interpretation of 162. We know today legal cannabis businesses are essentially the same as any other mainstream business. They deduct ordinary and necessary expenses such as rent, payroll, and advertising. And to define business expense, all the court asks is the expense, quote, appropriate and helpful for the development of the taxpayer's business? Now, by denying virtually all business deductions to businesses who traffic Schedule 1 or 2 substances, that business must pay taxes on gross receipts compared to other legal or even illegal businesses that pay taxes on net income. This podcast focuses on the application of Section 280E to the United States legal cannabis industry. Why? Because cannabis is the only Schedule 1 drug that has a legitimate marketplace today. When applied, Section 280E contradicts the intent of Section 280E itself, which is to punish illegal drug dealers, because Section 280E punishes legal businesses today. Section 280E is outdated because trafficking cannabis is legal in over 33 states and D.C. Section 280E doesn't satisfy the expectations of any of its goals, which was to combat the flow of drugs in the United States, significantly reducing drug use, or having an educational impact. So you just got done listening to part 2 of Florida's Cannabis News Podcast's 5-part series on cannabis taxation. Everything you need to know on Internal Revenue Code Section 280E. I hope you enjoyed that part. In part 3, we're going to talk about how Section 280E is crippling the development of today's United States legal cannabis industry, and how 280E is actually indirectly subsidizing the black market. Next part is going to be awesome. And if you think I do a decent job of breaking down the laws, analyzing cannabis news, consider rating the show, leaving a review, and subscribing. I saw we had a couple reviews come in over the weekend in the Apple Podcasts review section, so that was really appreciated. Thank you so much. Continue to write those reviews and share with your friends. I also recommend visiting our website, floridacannabispod.com, signing up for our free newsletter. That way I can send episodes directly to your inbox and give you updates about events and upcoming things in the cannabis industry. If you have a product to promote, you have a story you want to share, an event that's coming up that you want people to know about, consider reaching out to me on Twitter at FLCannabisPod or emailing me, david@floridacannabispod.com. Thank you again, listeners, for taking the time out of your day to learn more about Florida's cannabis industry, and I will see you next time.